The bridge of the alien warship hummed with strange energy as Commander Vrex stood before the glowing display, and his 4 eyes studied the planet that spun slowly in the darkness of space, and the world below was covered in blue oceans and green lands, and white clouds drifted across its surface like soft cotton. And Vrex clicked his sharp mandibles together in amusement as he watched this new world that his people had discovered, and the species living there called themselves humans, and they seemed weak and small and perfect for conquest. Vrex had conquered many worlds before this one, and he knew how to identify prey when he saw it, and these humans showed all the signs of being easy targets, and his second officer Kresh moved closer to look at the display, and together they studied the information their scouts had gathered about this strange new species, and what they learned made them confident that victory would come quickly and without much effort. The hologram changed to show a human male standing upright, and Vrex examined every detail of the creature with the practiced eye of a hunter who had killed many prey before, and the human had no claws on its soft hands and no sharp teeth in its small mouth and no thick scales or armor protecting its body, and the skin looked thin and easy to pierce with even the simplest weapons, and the creature stood on 2 legs which seemed unstable and slow compared to how the Zalthine moved on their powerful limbs. Vrex turned to his crew and announced that these humans were prey and nothing more, and they would fall quickly once the Zalthine began their attack, and the other warriors on the bridge clicked their mandibles in agreement and anticipation, and they had all seen prey species before, and they all knew the signs of weakness when they saw them, and these humans were clearly weak and helpless against the might of the Zalthine Dominion. Lieutenant Nex brought up a star map showing 3 colony worlds where humans had settled, and the populations were small and scattered, and the military presence was minimal at best, and Vrex selected the colony called New Boston as their first target, and it held 40,000 humans and only a few hundred soldiers and some basic weapons that seemed primitive compared to Zalthine technology. And this would be an easy victory that would show the humans what happened when they drew the attention of true predators. What Vrex did not know, and what none of the Zalthine could have guessed, was that humans had evolved very differently from most species in the galaxy, and while the Zalthine had become ambush hunters who relied on strength and speed and overwhelming force to capture their prey quickly, the humans had evolved as something far stranger and far more dangerous than the aliens could imagine. On the colony of New Boston, life continued as normal, and people went about their daily business without knowing that death was coming from the stars. And Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison sat in the defense station reviewing boring paperwork and drinking coffee and thinking about how quiet and peaceful his job had become over the years. And at 32 years old, Jake had served in the Colonial Defense Force for a decade, and the most exciting thing he had ever dealt with was a meteor shower that damaged some equipment. Corporal Amy Wright sat at her console monitoring the long-range sensors, and she called out to Jake that something strange was appearing at the edge of the star system, and multiple objects were dropping out of faster-than-light travel and approaching. The colony and Jake walked over to her station with his coffee still in hand, and asked what the identification codes were, and Amy told him there were no codes, and the ships were not responding to any messages, and they were coming in fast and direct toward New Boston. Jake felt something cold settle into his stomach, and he ordered Amy to sound the general alert and activate all defensive systems and get everyone to their emergency stations. And throughout the colony, alarms began to wail, and people who had never heard anything but practice drills moved with confusion toward the shelters, and the small military force of 300 personnel scrambled to their positions and prepared for something they had trained for, but never expected to actually happen. Director Helen Phillips rushed into the command center while still putting on her jacket, and she demanded a report, and Jake told her about the 3 unknown ships approaching and how they refused to communicate. And Helen looked at the display, showing 3 red dots moving toward their small blue dot, and she understood immediately that this was first contact and it was not friendly. Jake reported that all weapons systems were online, and they had 8 missile batteries and 12 railgun positions, and the point defense grid was active and ready, and Helen looked at their meager defenses and understood they were facing 3 warships with nothing but basic colonial equipment, and she ordered Jake to send a message to Earth and all other colonies to let everyone know what was happening, and to request help, even though she knew help would take days to arrive. Amy began broadcasting on all frequencies and sending the emergency message that New Boston was under approach by unknown hostile ships, and this was a first contact situation, and they needed immediate assistance, and the message began its long journey across space toward Earth and toward the nearest military bases and toward anyone who might be able to help. But New Boston was alone and help was far away. The Zalthine ships came screaming into the atmosphere, and their hulls glowed red from the heat of entry, and they looked like falling stars bringing death and destruction. And Commander Vrex watched from orbit as his 3 hunter pods descended toward the colony, and he was confident this would be quick and easy, and the humans would either surrender or die, and either way the Zalthine would have another world to add to their empire. The pods landed on the outskirts of the colony, and the doors opened, and Zalthine warriors emerged, and they stood 7 feet tall, and their bodies were covered in natural armor like insects, and they carried weapons that crackled with energy, and they moved with the confidence of predators who had never lost a hunt, and they expected the humans to run or hide or beg for mercy like all prey did when faced with superior force. What happened next surprised every Zalthine warrior on the ground, and shocked Commander Vrex watching from orbit, and changed everything both species thought they knew about predators and prey. The first squad of Zalthine encountered 4 human soldiers on patrol, and the aliens expected immediate surrender, but instead the humans opened fire without hesitation and without fear, and Corporal Danny Hayes led his small team from cover to cover, while shooting at the armored aliens, and his bullets found weak points in their natural armor, and 1 alien fell and then another. And Danny ordered his squad to fall back while fighting, and they moved like trained soldiers who refused to give up even when facing larger and stronger enemies. This pattern repeated across New Boston as the Zalthine advanced, and everywhere they went, they found humans who fought back with surprising ferocity, and even civilians joined the battle using tools and vehicles and anything they could find as weapons, and the aliens had never encountered prey that acted like this, and they had never seen such determination and refusal to surrender from creatures they considered weak and helpless. The news from New Boston traveled across space and reached Earth like thunder in a quiet room, and for the first time in human history, the species faced an enemy from beyond their world, and the United Earth government gathered in emergency session within hours of receiving the desperate message from the colony, and everyone understood that everything had changed and nothing would ever be the same again. Admiral Frank Cooper stood before the military council and showed them footage from New Boston, and the council watched in silence as alien warriors attacked the colony, and as human soldiers fought back with courage and desperation, and as the enemy finally pulled back after taking losses. And Frank had served in the military for 40 years, and he understood what this attack meant for humanity and for the future of their species. The Secretary General Patricia Moore asked what the aliens had learned from their attack, and Frank explained that the enemy now knew humans would fight back and would not surrender easily. But they also learned that human defenses on the frontier were weak and limited, and if the aliens came back with more ships and more warriors, the colonies would not survive without help. And Patricia asked how much time they had, and Frank told her maybe 2 or 3 months before the enemy organized a larger attack. Patricia stood and gave Admiral Cooper full authorization to mobilize the entire fleet, and to prepare every ship and every weapon and every soldier for war. And she also wanted to evacuate the frontier colonies, but Frank explained they did not have enough transport ships to move 2 million people in just a few months, and Patricia made the hard decision that they would defend the colonies where they stood, and Frank would get whatever resources he needed to make that defense possible. The call went out across human space, and warships that had only practiced for war suddenly prepared for real combat, and soldiers who joined during peacetime now faced the reality of fighting and dying against an alien enemy, and scientists rushed their experimental weapons into production, and the entire human civilization transformed itself into a war machine, focused on one goal, which was survival at any cost. Jake Morrison found himself promoted to full commander and given command of New Boston's expanded defense force, and ships began arriving in the system, and personnel poured onto the colony, and what had been a quiet frontier settlement became a fortress bristling with weapons and soldiers, and Jake stood on the command deck watching the 3rd heavy cruiser take position in orbit, and he thought about how his life had changed in just 2 months. Captain Lisa Hayes commanded the battleship Houston, and she was a career officer with 20 years of experience, and she came to New Boston to help Jake prepare for the next attack, and she told him that every commander in the fleet had studied his defense, and everyone wanted to know how he managed to destroy one of the alien ships, and Jake explained it was concentrated fire and luck, because the enemy had not expected any resistance. Lisa said that next time the aliens would be ready for a fight, and they would come with more ships and better tactics, and Jake agreed, and said that meant humans needed to be ready to surprise them again, and both of them knew the next battle would be harder than the first and more people would die, but they also knew they had no choice except to fight. On the Zalthine command ship, Commander Vrex stood before the Dominion Council and reported his failure, and admitting defeat was dangerous among his people. But lying was worse, and he told the Council that humans proved more difficult than expected, but a full battle fleet would overwhelm their defenses and crush any resistance, and the humans were still prey, and they would fall like all prey eventually did. Warlord Thax was the leader of the Council, and he was massive even by Zaltine standards, and his anger was clear as he growled that Vrex had lost a hunter pod to prey species, and this was unacceptable and shameful. And Vrex explained that humans had advanced weapons and unusual tactics, but they were still weaker than true predators, and with enough force they would break and surrender. Thax commanded Vrex to take 50 warships and crush the human colonies, and show the galaxy that the Zalthine Dominion did not tolerate resistance from prey, and Vrex bowed and accepted the command, and as the council meeting ended, he felt a strange unease about the humans that he could not explain, and something about the way they fought reminded him of old stories from his homeworld. Long ago, before the Zalthine reached the stars, there had been creatures on their planet that hunted in packs, and they were small and weak compared to the Zalthine, but they never stopped chasing their prey, and they would follow wounded animals for days without rest until their target collapsed from exhaustion, and the Zalthine had driven those creatures to extinction. But the memory remained in their culture, and Vrex wondered if humans were somehow similar to those ancient hunters, but he pushed the thought away because humans were civilized and modern and nothing like primitive pack hunters. 2 months passed, and the Zalthine gathered their fleet and 50 warships assembled at the edge of Zalthine space, and it was an armada designed to destroy any opposition and crush any defense, and Vrex commanded this fleet, and he was confident that the humans would break when they saw such overwhelming force arrayed against them. Jake stood in the combat center of New Boston's orbital fortress and watched 50 red dots appear on the tactical display, like drops of blood falling into clear water. And Amy Wright looked at the display, and her voice was tight with fear as she counted 50 enemy ships against their 20 defending vessels, and Jake smiled grimly and said that made it an even fight. He ordered all ships to battle stations and activated the minefields they had placed throughout the system, and told someone to play music through the command center because he refused to die in silence. And Amy looked confused, but Jake explained that if this was their last stand, they would go out making noise and letting the universe know that humans had been here and had fought and had made the enemy pay. Jake opened a channel to all defending ships and told every captain and every crew that the enemy came expecting easy prey, but humans would prove them wrong, and they would make the aliens remember this day and remember the name New Boston and remember that humans do not die quietly or surrender easily. And across the fleet, the crews prepared for battle with fear and determination mixed together. The Zalthine fleet advanced in perfect formation like a wall of death moving through space, and Vrex watched from his command ship and felt confident in victory, because 50 ships against 20 meant certain defeat for the humans, and they would learn that resistance was futile against the power of the Zalthine Dominion. Then the first mines exploded and space lit up with fire, and 3 Zalthine ships took damage, and the perfect formation broke apart as ships tried to avoid the explosions, and Vrex ordered evasive maneuvers and countermeasures, and the fleet pushed through the minefield, but they were scattered and disorganized. That was when the human fleet attacked, and 20 ships came screaming out from behind the planet, and they did not form defensive lines or try to protect anything, and instead they charged straight at the enemy like predators attacking prey, and Jake commanded all ships to fire everything they had and show the aliens what humans were capable of when fighting for survival. Hundreds of missiles erupted from the human ships and crossed the space between the fleets in seconds, and the Zalthine point defense systems shot down most of them but not all, and explosions blossomed across alien hulls. And then the human ships closed to point-blank range and fired railguns and lasers, and fought with tactics that seemed suicidal but were terrifyingly effective. 3 months after the Battle of New Boston, the war spread across 24 star systems, and the Zalthine Dominion kept attacking, and humans kept fighting back, and neither side could gain a decisive advantage, and the conflict became a grinding war of attrition that exhausted both sides and changed everything about how they saw each other and themselves. Admiral Frank Cooper stood in Earth Defense Station watching holographic displays that showed fleet movements across human space, and every red dot represented a Zolthene attack, and every blue dot showed a human response. And Colonel Brandon Lewis stood beside Frank and commented that the aliens were everywhere and attacking constantly. And Frank explained that the enemy was trying to spread human forces thin and exhaust them like predators wearing down prey. Brandon asked if the strategy was working, and Frank smiled grimly and said the Zolthene did not understand humans yet, and they thought humans would break if pushed hard enough, but humans were not built to break, and they were built to endure and keep fighting no matter what. And every battle made humanity stronger instead of weaker. And eventually the aliens would learn this lesson, but it would cost them dearly. The truth was that human evolutionary history prepared them perfectly for this kind of war. And ancient humans hunted prey not by being faster or stronger, but by being more persistent, and they ran their prey to exhaustion and followed them for days and never gave up until they won. And that same quality now expressed itself across space as humans fought battles that lasted weeks and never surrendered even when losing. Commander Vrex learned to hate a human word that kept appearing in reports, and the word was guerrilla, and it meant fighting with irregular tactics and hit-and-run attacks, and using terrain to advantage, and the humans had become masters of this type of warfare. And on every world the Zolthene captured, the humans refused to accept defeat, and instead faded into forests and mountains and continued fighting. On Settlers Ridge, the Zolthene forces technically won the battle, and they controlled all the major cities and spaceports, but the human population had not surrendered, and instead they disappeared into the wilderness and kept attacking supply convoys. And patrols and Zolthene warriors who ventured into the forests often did not return, and those who did come back spoke of terrifying encounters with humans who appeared from nowhere and struck hard and vanished like ghosts. Kresh reported to Vrex that another supply convoy had been destroyed just 20 kilometers from their main base, and the attackers used improvised weapons and wore no uniforms, and some appeared to be civilians, and Vrex could not understand why. Non-combatants would fight against trained warriors, and Kresh explained that humans did not seem to distinguish between soldiers and civilians, and everyone fought when their world was invaded. This was unprecedented in Zolthene experience and in every previous conquest. Once the organized military was defeated, the civilian population either surrendered or fled, but humans did neither, and teachers and farmers and merchants picked up weapons and became fighters, and even children helped by running messages and planting traps and gathering intelligence, and the entire population became an army that never stopped resisting. Sergeant Nina Cole had been a schoolteacher before the invasion, and now she commanded 23 resistance fighters who made life miserable for the Zolthene occupation force, and they knew every trail and every hiding spot in the forests around Settlers Ridge. And they used that knowledge to ambush patrols and destroy equipment and gather weapons from fallen enemies. Danny Reed was just 16 years old, and he had been one of Nina's students before the war, and now he was one of her best scouts. And he whispered to Nina that 2 Zolthene warriors were moving along the ridge toward the valley. And Nina studied them through binoculars and watched how they moved with the confidence of apex predators who had never faced serious opposition. Nina positioned her fighters carefully and told Danny to take the alien on the left, while she took the one on the right, and everyone else stayed hidden and ready to scatter if the ambush went wrong, and the Zolthene walked closer completely unaware of the danger, until 2 shots rang out and both aliens fell dead before they understood what happened. The humans waited in perfect silence for 10 minutes to make sure no reinforcements were coming, and then they quickly stripped the bodies of weapons and equipment and melted back into the forest like smoke. And Danny asked how many aliens they had killed this month, and Nina said 8, but they would keep fighting until every Zolthene left their world or died trying to hold it. This scene repeated across Settlers Ridge and every other occupied world, and the Zolthene could win battles, but they could not pacify the populations, and every day cost them resources and soldiers and morale, and the humans simply refused to stop fighting no matter how many times they lost or how much they suffered. And this persistence wore down the occupiers in ways they never expected. Vrex reported to the Dominion Council again, and this time the news was even worse than before, and he explained that they controlled 7 human colonies, but none were pacified, and casualties continued mounting every day, and supply lines were under constant attack, and the humans refused to surrender no matter what the Zolthene did to them. Warlord Thax growled that if humans would not submit, Then the Zalthine should kill them all and eliminate the problem through extermination. But Vrex carefully explained that they had tried targeted killings, and it only made the resistance stronger. And for every human they killed, 2 more joined the fight. And the humans did not fear death the way normal prey species did. Another warlord demanded to know what humans feared if not death. And Vrex hesitated because he was beginning to understand something terrifying about humanity. And he said quietly that humans might not fear anything, or if they did, they hid it. Better than any species the Zalthine had ever encountered, and they fought despite their fear instead of running from it. And this made them far more dangerous than any prey should be. On Earth, the war effort transformed human society completely, and every factory worked day and night producing weapons and ammunition, and every shipyard built warships as fast as possible, and every university focused on military technology and finding ways to hurt the enemy more effectively, and humanity became a civilization focused entirely on survival and victory. Dr. Lauren Bennett worked in a research facility beneath the mountains, and she developed new weapons designed specifically to counter Zalthine technology, and she explained to Admiral Frank that Zalthine shields were optimized against energy, weapons and kinetic impacts, but they had a weakness in their armor that could be exploited. She showed him the molecular structure of Zalthine chitin armor, and pointed out that it became brittle under specific electromagnetic frequencies, and her team had designed a rifle that fired electromagnetically charged rounds that would shatter alien armor on impact, and Frank asked when they could start mass production, and Lauren said 3 months if they could get the necessary materials. Frank promised she would have whatever resources she needed, because giving human soldiers an advantage could save lives and win battles, and this drive to adapt and overcome was humanity's secret weapon against an enemy that fought the same way for centuries and never changed their tactics or learned from defeats. Human pilots developed new attack patterns designed to exploit Zalthine blind spots and ground forces, invented traps that turned enemy weapons against them, and civilians contributed by creating improvised explosives and communication jammers. And everyone worked together to find ways to hurt the enemy and survive another day. Commander Jake Morrison commanded all defensive operations in the New Boston sector, and he watched as his forces repelled the 4th Zalthine attack in 4 weeks. And Amy Wright observed that the enemy kept coming with the same tactics and never seemed to learn. And Jake explained that predators relied on strength and speed, and they were not built for extended conflicts, but humans were persistence hunters who got stronger with each battle. Amy asked what would happen if humans broke first, and Jake smiled and said they would not break because humans did not know how to quit, and it was not in their nature to surrender, and every battle taught them something new and made them more effective. And eventually the Zalthine would realize they could not win a war of attrition against an enemy that refused to stay down. The war entered its 9th month, and everything changed when humanity stopped defending and started attacking, and the prey became the predator, and the hunter became the hunted, and the Zalthine Dominion found itself facing an enemy that no longer ran from battle but sought it out with terrifying determination. Admiral Frank Cooper stood before the military council and presented a plan called Operation Enduring Hunt, and the holographic display showed human fleets pushing deep into Zalthine territory and attacking their worlds and supply bases and forcing them to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. And it was an audacious strategy that risked everything humanity had built. General Marcus Powell commanded the ground forces, and he questioned whether going on the offensive was wise when humans were still outnumbered in total military strength. But Frank explained that numbers did not matter as much as will, and the Zalthine were exhausted after 9 months of grinding warfare, while humanity was just getting started, and now was the perfect time to strike. Secretary General Patricia Moore asked what made Frank think humans could win, and Frank smiled grimly and explained that this war was not about who had better technology or more ships, and it was about who wanted victory more, and nobody in the galaxy wanted to survive more than humans did, and that desire would carry them to victory if they had the courage to seize it. The plan was approved, and within weeks human fleets began offensive operations across multiple sectors, and the strategy was simple but devastating, and they hit the Zalthine everywhere at once and gave them no rest and no chance to recover, and it was persistence hunting on an interstellar scale, and the same tactics ancient humans used to exhaust prey. Commander Jake Morrison led the assault on Settlers Ridge, and his fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel with overwhelming force, and 30 warships, including 3 battleships, arrived to liberate the colony that had suffered under occupation. For 6 months, and Jake commanded all ships to fire at will and target the orbital stations first, while ground forces prepared to land. The battle for orbit lasted 14 hours and the Zalthine defenders fought hard, but they were already worn down by months of guerrilla warfare on the surface, and now they faced a full-scale assault from space, and ship after ship fell to concentrated human firepower until the orbital defenses collapsed completely. Major Alex Carter commanded the Marine forces, and his troops descended in armored drop pods that slammed into the ground around the main Zalthine base, and Alex transmitted to all resistance cells that the cavalry had arrived, and it was time to take back their world. And from the forests emerged Nina Cole and hundreds of other fighters who had been hiding and surviving and fighting for 6 long months. The Zalthine garrison numbered 3,000 warriors, and they expected to fight scattered resistance groups armed with improvised weapons. But instead they faced coordinated attacks by professional Marines, supported by orbital bombardment and guided by locals who knew every inch of terrain, and the battle was brutal and one-sided. Commander Vrex received distress calls from Settlers Ridge and 6 other occupied worlds, and the humans were attacking everywhere at the same time. And he asked Kresh how many fleets were involved, and Kresh reported at least 7 major offensives, and possibly more, and they were hitting every occupied system simultaneously. Vrex realized with horror that the humans had learned Zalthine tactics and were now using them against their creators. And he wanted to reinforce the besieged garrisons but had no ships to spare because pulling forces from one sector would just invite attack there. And the humans had turned the tables completely, and now the Zalthine were the ones being hunted. The liberation of Settlers Ridge took 3 days of intense fighting, and when it ended, the Zalthine garrison was destroyed or captured, and Nina Cole stood in the town square where she once taught children, and watched as freed civilians celebrated, and exhausted soldiers rested, and she felt tears on her face for the first time in months. Danny Reed stood beside her, still carrying the rifle he had used throughout the occupation, and he said they had actually done it, and won back their world. And Nina replied that it was not over yet, because this was just one colony, and there were many more still under enemy control, but it was a start and a good one. Across human space, similar scenes played out, and Crimson Valley was liberated and New Horizon was freed. And one by one the occupied colonies were taken back as human forces pushed forward with relentless determination, and every victory drove home a terrible truth to the Zalthine, that they were not the apex predators they thought they were. The offensive was not just about reclaiming territory, but about breaking the enemy psychologically and showing them that humans were persistence hunters who never stopped chasing prey once they caught the scent, and every defeat taught the Zalthine that they had made a terrible mistake when they attacked humanity. In the Zalthine capital, Warlord Thax convened an emergency council meeting, and for the first time in their empire's history they discussed the possibility of defeat, and one warlord reported that their forces were in retreat across multiple sectors, and the humans were pursuing them even when they withdrew, and they never stopped coming. Thax demanded they commit the reserve fleets and every ship they had to stop the human advance. But another warlord asked quietly what they would do if that was not enough, and the question hung in the air unanswered, because the Zalthine had never considered what would happen if they encountered prey that refused to be prey. Commander Vrex found himself defending a Zalthine colony, and the irony was not lost on him because he had started the war attacking human worlds, and now he was trying to protect his own people from human assault, and his fleet had been reduced from over 100 ships to just 37, and they were dug in around a mining colony waiting for the humans to arrive. Kresh observed that the humans were making the Zalthine feel what they had made humans feel, and the fear and desperation and certainty of defeat. And Vrex agreed, but said they would fight with everything they had when the enemy arrived, though he no longer believed victory was possible. The human fleet arrived 3 hours later, and 50 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and Captain Lisa Hayes commanded from the Houston, and she had survived 4 major battles and countless smaller fights, and she had learned to hunt with cold efficiency, and now she brought that knowledge to bear against the enemy. Lisa commanded all ships to take battle formation and target heavy units first and press them hard and give them no mercy and no quarter until they surrendered, and her fleet moved forward like a pack of wolves closing on exhausted prey, and the Zalthine tried to fight, but they were outmatched and outmaneuvered. Vrex watched his fleet die around him, and ship after ship fell to human weapons, and every tactic his people had used against humanity was now employed against them, And when Zaltine ships tried to retreat, human destroyers pursued. And when they tried to dig in, human battleships hammered them with overwhelming fire. Kresh told Vrex quietly that they needed to surrender because continuing to fight would only result in everyone dying for nothing. And Vrex replied that Zaltine do not surrender, but Kresh said then Zaltine will die. And for what reason, and for what purpose? Vrex looked at his old friend and at the tactical display showing his dying fleet, and with shaking hands he opened a channel to the human fleet and requested terms of surrender. And it was the hardest thing he had ever done, because it meant admitting defeat to prey species. Lisa Hayes received the surrender request and smiled grimly, and told Vrex to maintain position and any hostile action would be met with immediate destruction, and she asked if he understood, and Vrex replied that he understood, and his voice was hollow with defeat. Lisa said welcome to being prey and asked if it was pleasant, and Vrex had no answer, because he finally understood what humans had felt when his people attacked them, and the terror and helplessness and desperation. And now the hunter had become the hunted, and the lesson was learned in blood and fire. The war officially ended 11 months after it began in a neutral space station, where Admiral Frank Cooper represented humanity, and Warlord Thax led the Zaltine delegation, and between them sat a treaty that would reshape the entire galaxy and change how every species viewed humans forever. Thax growled through his translator that the human terms were harsh, and demanded reparations and territory, and recognition of human sovereignty across 20 star systems, and his 4 eyes narrowed with something that might have been anger, or might have been respect. Frank replied calmly that the Zaltine invasion had killed 300,000 humans, and destroyed 17 colonies, and turned 2 million people into refugees, and the terms being offered were generous, considering humanity could continue the war until the Dominion collapsed entirely under the pressure. Thax studied the human admiral and said quietly that humans would actually do that, and hunt the Zaltine to extinction if necessary, and Frank said yes without hesitation, and explained that humans were adaptable, and could be either the worst nightmare or the best trading partner, and the choice belonged to the Zaltine. The warlord sat in silence for a long moment, and Frank Cooper did not look impressive by Zaltine standards, because he stood barely 6 feet tall and had no natural weapons, and looked fragile compared to any Zaltine warrior. But he sat at the negotiating table with absolute confidence, backed by a fleet that had proven capable of destroying the Dominion. Thax asked how the Zaltine had misjudged humanity so completely, and what they had missed when evaluating humans as potential prey, and Frank leaned back and explained that the aliens judged by predator standards and looked for claws and fangs, and armor, and they missed what actually made humans dangerous. The warlord asked what that was, and Frank said simply that humans do not quit, and they cannot be scared into submission, or exhausted into surrender, or broken by pain, and every time they get knocked down, they stand back up, and every defeat teaches them something new, and they come back stronger. Thax said that sounded like insanity, and Frank corrected him and said it was called determination, and explained that Zaltine evolution made them ambush predators who strike fast and hard, and if prey escapes, they find easier targets. But human evolution made them persistence hunters who chase prey for days and adapt to defenses and never stop until they win or die. The warlord signed the treaty because he had no real choice, and the alternative was complete destruction of his empire by an enemy that would never stop coming. And the lesson had been learned at terrible cost, and the Zaltine would never again mistake appearance for capability. On Earth, the news of peace was met with celebration, mixed with grief, and humanity had won. But the cost was terrible, and every family lost someone, and every city had memorials to the fallen, and the scars would remain for generations. Commander. Jake Morrison attended a memorial service on New Boston, where the war had begun, and the colony was rebuilt better than before, but reminders of the fighting were everywhere, and he stood before a wall inscribed with names and found those of soldiers who had served under his command and died following his orders. Nina Cole stood beside Jake, and she had returned to teaching, but the war changed her permanently, and she said they would remember everyone who died and every sacrifice made, and Jake agreed and said the fallen had saved humanity, and Nina corrected him and said they saved civilization itself. Jake commented that humans had not broken at New Boston, and if they had broken here the war would have been lost, and Nina said that was not what humans do, and breaking was not in their nature, and they were survivors who adapted and endured no matter what. Across the former war zones, humans rebuilt and remembered and moved forward, doing what they had always done, which was adapting to circumstances and enduring hardship and creating new futures from the ashes of the past. In the Zalthine Dominion, the war sparked a crisis of identity, and for generations they had defined themselves as supreme predators and apex beings who conquered everything they encountered. But humanity shattered that self-image and forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about strength and power. Commander Vrex survived the war and found himself teaching at a Zalthine military academy, and he stood before young warriors trying to explain how the war was lost and why the Dominion suffered its first major defeat in history. A young student asked how prey species could defeat the mighty Zalthine, and Vrex said firmly that humans were not prey, and that was the first mistake and the most critical error in judgment, and humans were apex predators who evolved differently and possessed advantages that were invisible until revealed in combat. He explained that where Zalthine developed strength and speed, humans developed endurance and adaptability, and where Zalthine hunted by overwhelming prey, quickly, humans hunted by never giving up, and they could be hurt and scared, and they could lose battles, but they could not be made to surrender. Vrex showed footage from the war displaying human soldiers fighting impossible odds and human ships ramming Zalthine vessels in suicide attacks, and human civilians taking up weapons against trained warriors, and he told his students to really look at the determination in human eyes. He said that was not the look of prey, but the look of predators who caught a scent and would follow it across the universe if necessary. And the Zalthine learned too late what humans really were, and the lesson was taught in blood and fire and loss. A student asked what they should do if they encountered humans again, and Vrex said, treat them as equals, or better yet, as partners, because treating them as prey would result in another war, and another lesson learned the hard way. The peace between humanity and the Zalthine held, because both sides learned valuable lessons and the aliens learned that appearance was not everything and different evolutionary paths created different types of strength, and humanity learned they possessed capabilities they never fully recognized before. 5 years after the war ended, the first joint human-Zalthine expedition launched to explore new star systems, and the crew was mixed with both species working together, and Captain Lisa Hayes commanded the human contingent aboard the exploration. Ship Discovery and Commander Vrex led the Zalthine personnel. Lisa commented during their first briefing that it was strange how things turned out because 5 years ago they were trying to kill each other, and now they explored together, and Vrex agreed and said both species were curious and intelligent and capable of learning from mistakes. Lisa said the war taught them that both species were predators, just different kinds, and Vrex agreed but added that humans were something more than predators, and they were survivors who adapted to anything and overcame everything and refused to accept defeat. And it was both terrifying and admirable. The expedition succeeded in discovering 3 habitable worlds and establishing the foundation for an alliance that grew stronger over time, and the war had forged respect between species that might not have existed otherwise, and both sides were better for the experience. On Earth, in schools and academies, the war became required study, and children learned about battles and strategies and sacrifices. But more importantly, they learned about human nature and the qualities that allowed their species to survive and thrive against overwhelming odds. Dr. Lauren Bennett taught at the University of Mars, and her course on human evolutionary advantages in warfare was always full, and she explained to students that humans won not through superior strength or technology, but through persistence and determination. She told her students that humans were persistence hunters, and that was what their ancestors were on ancient Earth, and that was what they became again when threatened, and they chased the Zalthine across the galaxy, the same way ancient humans chased prey across savannas. A student protested that humans were civilized now and not hunters anymore, and Lauren replied that civilization was a thin layer over ancient instincts, and beneath the surface, humans were still the species that conquered Earth through determination rather than strength. Admiral Frank Cooper gave a final speech at the Memorial on Earth, honoring those who died in the war, and millions watched both human and alien, and Frank said that humans did not want war and did not ask to become warriors, but when faced with extinction, they discovered their true nature. He explained that humans survived ice ages and plagues and famines and disasters and faced extinction many times in their history, and every time they endured, and the Zalthine invasion was just another challenge and another obstacle to overcome. Frank looked at the memorial listing 300,000 names and said these people gave everything, so humanity could survive, and they showed the galaxy what humans were capable of when pushed to the limit, and they proved humans were not the strongest or fastest or most advanced species, but they were the most determined. He concluded that the war taught humanity who they really were, and they were explorers and scientists and artists. But they were also hunters and persistence hunters who evolved to outlast and outthink and overcome any obstacle, and that was their heritage and their strength. The galaxy learned to respect humanity, and they learned that humans were never prey, and they were always the predators wearing civilization as camouflage. And when that mask came off, the universe discovered what Earth's apex species was truly capable of achieving.